Welcome back to Grit to Glow podcast. I'm Naomi, your host, and I'm so excited to dive into today's episode with you. Today's episode is a really honest one for me. It's something I've been sitting with, noticing, and really unraveling for myself as 2025 came to a close. So right now, I want to open up a conversation with you, and this might be, I guess, a disclaimer that this could be a really deep and triggering conversation if you are somebody who has or is currently processing trauma or grief. Okay. So I want to talk about identity, but this conversation is going to come from a place of not being super polished in that, but really from the kind of identity that forms quietly while you're in survival mode. So for me, for a long time, I thought I was building my life and my business through my goals, all from the center of strength and ambition and grit. And in many ways I was, but one thing that I realized this year that I didn't see until I started digging deeper into healing was how much of what I was doing was actually driven by unprocessed grief, old traumas, and beliefs that I didn't even really realize were running the show. So this year has shown me the difference, I guess, if you will, between building from survival and from building from knowing, between proving and trusting, between running and choosing. And if you have ever felt like you're doing all the things right, but yet you still feel this heaviness or tense or exhausted underneath all of it, this episode today is for you. So what does survival-based identity actually look like? I want to peel this back because I think sometimes people think that survival is always chaotic. But survival doesn't always have to look chaotic in your life. Sometimes it looks like being hyper capable about things. Sometimes it looks like always moving, always on the go, can't sit still, can't rest, like won't allow yourself to rest. Sometimes it looks like always handling things, but just silently pushing down those feelings, right? Survival identity is often praised because we look at the people around us who are quote unquote working hard, right? We look at them and we say, wow, look at her. She does it all. And meanwhile, that survival identity is forming because slowing down doesn't actually feel safe for that person. Because resting feels like an irresponsible thing, or like it might be looked at as lazy. Because success feels like a protection barrier, right? From whatever it is that you're either consciously or subconsciously fearful of. So this year, survival taught me how to keep going, but it didn't teach me how to feel safe while doing it. And it really was the realization that I was in survival mode that made me come to healing and made me come to taking the time to actually work through some of those underlying traumas and hidden things that I was moving through that were limiting beliefs. It helped me move through the conscious grief that I knew I hadn't moved through with things like the loss of my father. And because I chose consciously to move through that grief, to move through that trauma, to move through those limiting beliefs this year and do the hard, gritty work to move through that, I have come out on the other side stronger and with a fresh perspective on how to live and not have to feel like you have to just survive and get by. So I want to share my personal story with you today around how I was running without even realizing it. And I want to kind of lead this conversation with a disclaimer of grief and trauma didn't stop me. They actually fueled me. And for me, this didn't come from a place of like, I was consciously just running from that to not deal with it. It was more so that I use that to propel my legacy. So when I say that, what I mean is when I lost my dad, and for those of you who don't know this story, my dad actually passed away in 2020. He was diagnosed with a brain tumor, glioblastoma, brain cancer, and 16 days later, he passed away. This was also in the midst of COVID, And so there was the pandemic and the whole world was shut down. It was like 2 weeks after the whole world was basically shut down and you couldn't really go anywhere and people didn't know what was happening next. So when my mom took him to the hospital on April 9th of 2020, she had to drop him at the curb. She couldn't go in with him, and he had a migraine for a few days that was basically debilitating. And she thought that she was going to pick him up in 24 hours with some migraine medication, go home, and continue living life. And that just wasn't what happened. What unraveled over the next 16 days and the level of complexity to the situation, the lack of being able to be there physically for him, like there were so many layers to what happened. And for the first couple of months, I didn't necessarily process the trauma from that situation. I just was moving through the grief to be able to show up for my 2-year-old daughter at that time. And in the midst of that, in the midst of all of that happening, I had decided that I was going to choose positivity, that I was going to choose to be a light to those who were moving through the same things and share about my journey of, having lost him and the things that I was moving through and how I was moving through that from a place of pouring into my workouts and doing the things. And what I was really doing is I was using that as a protection mechanism. I was avoiding the processing of things, avoiding sitting with pain, avoiding stillness, avoiding asking the deeper rooted questions, because I thought that by being productive, I could still continue forward and live my life. And I could just say, well, I'm just a positive individual. Things like this just don't get to me. The realization that I wasn't broken or that I wasn't just coping just to cope, like those realizations helped me seek healing eventually, right? Like there are parts of it that I moved through over the 5 years leading up to my conscious awareness of, needing to move through even more of it. But there was this part of me that had to also accept that going deeper into some of those conversations about whatever existed for me around that time needed to happen for me to fully heal and fully close this loop of grief and trauma that I was moving through. And that was impacting every other area of my life. And I think that this is something that we don't talk enough about, is that even if you're protecting yourself or you are avoiding those conversations, that there are ways that grief and trauma show up for you in your personal life that impact the people around you and the world around you and the things that you do on a day-to-day basis, even if you don't realize it, right? So what happened during this time as I was dealing with all of this in 2020, 2021, is I didn't collapse from it. I actually accelerated, and I called it ambition, but part of it was actually avoidance, right? And so what I did for myself was stay busy. That way I didn't have to feel certain things. And again, most of that was not conscious. That was just me surviving. And what my brain was doing to protect me was, looking for evidence that there was joy somewhere else, looking for evidence that there was fulfillment somewhere else, looking for evidence that there was anything but sadness that got to exist, right? And this kind of brings me to beliefs, because I had some hidden beliefs coming up for me during my healing journey of things that felt responsible. So I want to talk to you about that today, because I think this is where it gets juicy when you tie personal in with business, is that oftentimes as individuals, we feel that things like more money requires more effort, or rest comes after success, or slowing down is actually going to risk everything, because if we feel something, right, in those moments of grief and trauma and hardship, that everything else around us might crumble. But some of the things I didn't realize that were happening was those beliefs that I was creating inside of my business around things like how I priced myself, how I worked, how I held myself, were showing up in a way that was limiting me. I was feeling like more money required more effort. So even as there was evidence in front of me that I was continuing to grow and was able to increase my prices while working the same number of hours, I still felt like this sense of imposter syndrome of what's going to come up when somebody questions what I'm doing in the day-to-day. What's going to come up for me? How am I going to handle it when somebody says, well, I don't think you should be charging this much? How do I defend myself in that? Like, those were all real-time beliefs that I was having to work through, because I had still held the belief, even through my success, that more money requires more effort. So one thing that changed for me as I've released some of those limiting beliefs is that I no longer feel this sense of unsafety around success. And because success didn't feel unsafe and stillness did, I now trust myself to be still in the moments I need to be still, to not have to feel like I have to work hard or else something is going to happen, but rather that I can show up genuinely in each moment, day to day, not having to have necessarily a plan all the time, right? I can have my calendar laid out, but there's things that can happen, right? I'm a mom, and I know a lot of you are moms that are listening right now, and it's like things are going to come up, but when we learn to trust ourselves so deeply that we can accomplish things and not take things quite so seriously with the business side of things, and know that like we are capable and we are worthy and we will still make things happen that we want to happen because of who we are, not because of what we've been through, or not because of what someone else's perception might be because of the situation, but rather showing up from a place of authenticity and saying, okay, if my daughter gets sick and I have to take the day off work, are my clients going to feel any which way about it? It's like, no, I built this business and I trust myself that I have curated the roster or the team of clients that I have who know my values, who know what my first priority is, who know how family oriented I am, and trust that they are going to see that I'm still going to show up for them, because I have proven to them time and time again as we've worked together, whether it's been for 2 weeks or for 2 years, I've done that no matter the circumstances, right? So it's this shift from survival to knowing. And I think this is really the turning point for most people. It's that what knowing feels like, right? It's being grounded in your own body, being calm, being embodied, being less frantic or chaotic. It's the difference between that pushing and pushing and pushing yourself versus just choosing. It's that reacting versus deciding. Proactive versus reactive, right? Letting go of these ideas that your worth is tied to the output. Your safety is tied to the effort. It's not. You are your safe space, okay? And I think for me, a pivotal thing that I've done is I stopped asking myself, how do I do more? How do I do better? How do I, right? I could, how do I myself into the ground? And I really started asking, who am I being while I build? Who am I being in this moment? Who am I showing up as for this person in front of me, right? Because who you are now builds differently than the you that's in survival mode. So I want to truly tie this idea of identity to business and life for you today. How you build from knowing changes so much for you. And this comes from a place of decision making, pacing yourself, creating boundaries that are healthy, capacity, like all of these things are going to come from that knowing. Because when you're truthful about where you're actually at and what you actually want right now, you can map things out more accordingly to honor your capacity, to honor your pace and your boundaries and your decisions, right? This isn't about doing less for the sake of it, okay? I also want to throw that out there, because I think a lot of times it's like we as a society tend to overuse things like boundaries and capacity, Well, I'm never going to tell you my capacity or my boundaries are my excuse, right? Like I have traditional 8 to 3 business hours, Monday through Thursday. But if my daughter was homesick today, I wouldn't use the excuse that, well, I only work during 8 to 3. No, I'm going to show up for my clients because I have the luxury of doing that and the freedom to work around my family. And I've built a life where I get to do that, where it's not just about boundaries, but rather showing up and serving the people in my life that I have a commitment to. It's about letting my skills speak for themselves, yes, but it's also about my experience getting to lead the way, my flexibility and the desires of my heart getting to be a part of the equation. It's about letting my body and what feels good to me being involved, right? Like I don't have to choose just to hold the boundary of business hours. I can choose that it feels authentic and it feels loyal to me to show up for my clients, even if it's hard, even if there's so much going on in my life, because I have a commitment to them just as much as my family. But I also am honoring my family as the first priority when I show up for them in times of need, right? Or when it counts. So for you, I want you to realize today that knowing you and owning that sense of knowing, it's not rushed. It's learning to trust yourself. So I want to invite you today to go through a reflection period with yourself. I want you to sit with yourself right now. And I want you to ask yourself, what part of you learned to survive? What part of you along your journey in your life and lived experiences has learned to survive? What part of you is ready to lead? What part of you is ready to show up for your goals? And I want you to normalize that. I want you to normalize that survival once served you. I want you to acknowledge that your survival mode did once serve you, but that it also doesn't have to stay in charge of your life. That you get to release those limiting beliefs, that you get to release the chaos, you get to release the sense of hustle, you get to release the things that are happening to you and see them as things that are happening for you. That doesn't mean that you need to erase who you were, right? You just don't need to keep building from that place. So if this episode today stirred something for you, I want you to let it. I want you to let it. Because clarity doesn't always come from having the answers, but it does come from naming your truth. With that, I want to wrap up for today, but thank you so much for joining me for such a heartfelt episode of Grit to Glow. This was truly a very vulnerable share for me in so many ways, but also I hope that it helps even just one person. That's my goal, right? Like, when I started this podcast, it was never from a place of needing to serve thousands of individuals. And like, maybe someday that'll happen. I don't know. But really, truly, like if this just helps even just one woman today, then that is enough. So if this episode sparked an idea, if it sparked something inside of you, I would love to hear from you. Reach out to me in my DMs at Naomi Berm on Instagram. Come share your heart, come share your soul, come chat with me. I love connecting with you. So I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I will see you next week for our next episode. Mwah.